pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1748 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, we're going to talk about the MIA situation from the Southeastern War this country participated in back in the 1960s and 70s. That is a very sensitive issue, as it should be. Today, there are 1,587 missing personnel from that war that we fought so many years ago. We must never forget them, and we must never give up the search to find them or their remains. It is so important for the families of those MIAs to have closure. It was a terrible thing to lose them. The situation was only made worse when they were unable to properly memorialize their loved ones. Recently, there was a story on History.com about the MIA situation. It gives a very good review of the whole situation. I'm going to share that story with you to help maintain our memories about MIAs and our willingness to continue searching for them. Missing in Action: How Military Families in Tortuous Limbo Galvanized a Movement. Subtitle is, In the Wake of the Vietnam War, Families of Military Members Who Never Returned from Service Banded Together to Demand an Accounting. This story was provided by none other than Jessica Pierce Rotundi, a writer for History.com. She did a tremendous job with this story, and that's another reason I'm going to share it with you. Without any further ado, Dateline, History.com. MIA stands for Missing in Action, a term used to refer to members of the armed forces who have never returned from military service and whose whereabouts are unknown. Since ancient times, soldiers have gone to war and never returned, their fate unknown. In the wake of the Vietnam War, families of American MIAs began organizing to demand an accounting. The hunt continues. As of May 2020, 1,587 American service members were still missing in Southeast Asia. How many Americans are still missing in action? The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the agency within the Department of Defense responsible for tracking down MIAs, reported in May 2020 that 81,900 Americans were still considered MIA, 72,598 from World War II. That is a lot of MIAs. Of course, they were fighting in jungles and deserts and cities. I guess it was easy to become missing. In the Korean War, there are 7,580. Again, from Vietnam, there are 1,587. 126 from the Cold War and 6 from conflicts since 1991. Advances in DA technology increased access to crash sites or battlegrounds in territory once hostile to Americans, and ongoing international negotiations have helped bring more and more open cases to a close. Still, the issue of MIAs remains a controversial one, with accusations of government cover-ups continuing to foster distrust among families of the missing, particularly surrounding reparation efforts in Korea and Vietnam. Because the Korean War never officially ended, no peace treaty was ever formally signed, the recovery of American remains is complicated. Ongoing tensions between the United States and North Korea further impede the progress. In Korea, advancing American forces buried their dead in temporary cemeteries, assuming they could go back and claim the bodies once the war was won, as they had in World War II. When victory in Korea did not materialize, access to those burial sites did not either. Then there were the battles Americans lost that precluded the recording and burial of fallen American soldiers, like the Battle of Chosin, where 1,200 Marines were lost. Unrecorded deaths in prison camps also contributed to the high number of MIAs in Korea. The RAND Corporation maintains that a third of captured Americans died in captivity in the first year of the war, and the New York Times reported that about 1,500 Americans are believed to be buried in poorly marked graves beneath former POW camps. Moving on to the story of Vietnam War MIAs. The Paris Peace Accords, marking the end of the Vietnam War, were signed on January the 27th, 1973. The U.S. agreed to withdraw all of its troops and dismantle American bases in exchange for the release of all U.S. prisoners of war held by the North Vietnamese. That February, Operation Homecoming aired on American television, showing the release of American POWs from North Vietnamese prison camps. On March the 29th, 1973, 591 soldiers would be returned, and President Richard Nixon announced, for the first time in 12 years, no American military forces are in Vietnam. All of our American POWs are on their way home. At the time, 1,303 Americans were still unaccounted for. Over the years, rumors about men left behind and discrepancies in the number of missing versus the number of returned outraged MIA families, as did reports of the mishandling and misidentification of American remains. Action films like 1983's Uncommon Valor and Rambo: First Blood Part 2, 1985, fictionalized attempts at rescuing living soldiers from captivity in Vietnam. In 1991, a Wall Street Journal poll found that 69% of Americans believe there were living MIAs still being held captive in Southeast Asia. The National League of POW MIA Families. Sybil Stockdale was determined to bring her husband, Vice Admiral James Stockdale, home from the infamous Hoa Lo Prison, also known as the Hanoi Hilton, where none other than Senator John McCain was held. She joined with other families of MIAs to form the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia, a nonprofit incorporated in May of 1970 with the mission to obtain the release of all prisoners, the fullest possible accounting for the missing, and repatriation of all recoverable remains of those who died serving our nation during the Vietnam War. The greatest motivation for all of these families is uncertainty, says Ann Mills Griffiths, chairman of the board and CEO of the National League of POW MIA Families. Uncertainty is a killer. It is a great motivator to get you engaged. It's better to find out what happened to the missing than to endlessly stay in a state of uncertainty and frustration that you can't do anything about it, she said. The families were desperate. There was so much misinformation going around. Nobody wanted to talk about the veterans who had been ignored. The symbol of the POW-MIA movement is the POW-MIA flag, the brainchild of Mary Hoff, whose husband, Navy Lieutenant Commander Michael Hoff, was missing in action in Laos. World War II veteran Newton Heisley, a former pilot in the Army Air Corps, designed the flag in 1972 using his Marine son as the model for the black and white flag's famous silhouette. In 1979, Congress declared that the third Friday in September would be National POW-MIA Recognition Day. Starting in 1982, it became the day the POW-MIA flag was flown over the White House, just below the American flag, the only other flag to do so. In 1998, Congress mandated that the POW-MIA flag also be flown on holidays like Memorial Day, Independence Day, and Veterans Day. In November 2018, it became mandatory to fly the flag at select federal sites year-round, including the White House and memorials like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the World War II Memorial. For the families of MIAs, the flags and their memorials serve as places to remember. The whole theory was that the Vietnam veterans need, a place they would be recognized, said Jan Scruggs, founder of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Recovery of the MIAs. Under the George H.W. Bush administration, the Senate convened a select committee on POW MIA affairs chaired by Vietnam veteran John Kerry to investigate whether or not American prisoners were left behind in Southeast Asia. After testimony from high-profile officials like Henry Kissinger, the committee concluded this. While the committee has some evidence suggesting the possibility a POW may have survived to the present, and while some information remains to be investigated, there is, at this time, no compelling evidence that proves that any American remains alive in captivity in Southeast Asia. That was the comment made by John F. Kerry after the committee he chaired finished their investigation. Maybe he should have sent a plane loaded with billions of piastres over to Vietnam, and they might have showed up. Efforts to recover the bodies of American MIAs are ongoing. For years, recovery efforts in Southeast Asia were hampered by lack of resources, governments wary of letting Americans back in, and locals who remember the conflict all too well, says Sampatana Tommy Phizsayavong, a research analyst at the Department of Defense who works with teams recovering remains from the CIA's secret war in Laos. Phizsayavong has found that with the passage of time, locals are more willing to help in recovery efforts. I feel that now when I go on missions, people openly cooperate. The first time, villagers did not fully cooperate. 10 years later, we try again, and lo and behold, it's there, and they tell us. At the time, we could not tell you. Phizsayavong says he understands how conditions change over time. He fled the war as a child in the 1970s and has since been back to Laos over 100 times as part of the Joint Casualty Resolution Center, translating for the archaeologists who exhume American remains. He says this about his job. It is still so rewarding once you recover someone and return them to the family. In most cases, he's talking about just a piece of the body, like a tooth or a bone fragment or something. Whatever it is, it means so much to the families. And I appreciate so much what Mr. Phizsayavong and his associates are doing to find these remains. It is well worth the effort, and I don't mind at all that our country is spending the time, money, and resources to search for the missing in action in Vietnam. I encourage them to keep it up. That is the latest on the Vietnam MIA situation. Let's hope that pretty soon they can reduce that number of 1,587 MIAs down to 0. Something else they might want to consider is putting Jana Hain on the case. Jana Hain is the Sherlock Holmes of finding missing pictures of service members whose name is on the memorial wall in Washington, D.C. She lives out in Hawaii, so it's not that far, but I'm sure if she got on the case, she could find some of those remains. That's my opinion only, of course. I did not run that by her. I don't think she would be too big on it. She'll probably want to spend all her time finding the few remaining missing pictures to complete that Wall of Faces project. So Jana Hain, Sampatana Phizsayavong, and others, keep up the good work. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1748 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
If you like what you hear, How about that? Ain't that a mess?